Uloma's life, at least in the beginning, was one of promise and joy. She was born into a family of prosperity, a family that, in the eyes of their village, held wealth, security, and power. Her parents were kind, loving, and known for their generosity. Their wealth, though inherited, had been nurtured and expanded through hard work, and it was believed that their fortunes would be passed down to Uloma one day. The sprawling acres of farmland, the large family house, and the numerous livestock. All these were symbols of the life she was meant to inherit, but no one could foresee how quickly it would all come to an end. Uloma was only 12 when everything she knew was ripped away from her. Her parents, her pillar of support, were taken from her in a car accident that occurred when they were returning from the market. The news spread like wildfire in the village. The tragedy was not just the loss of two loving parents, but also the loss of an entire legacy, the land, the wealth, the future that Uloma's parents had built. The true cause of their deaths was the subject of whispered rumors almost immediately. While the authorities ruled the deaths as an accident, the village believed otherwise. There were whispers of foul play, suspicions that Uloma's parents had been poisoned. The rumors gained traction when people began to connect the dots. Uloma's family owned vast parcels of land inherited from several generations. In a village where resources were limited and greed ran deep, such wealth made them both revered and envied. Her parents' success had created many enemies among their neighbors and even within the extended family. Uloma's father, a man of integrity and fortitude, had often spoken about the importance of preserving the land for future generations, but his efforts were overshadowed by those who had always resented his family's prosperity. It was these very people who saw an opportunity for themselves when Uloma's parents passed away. Their lands were too valuable to be left in the hands of a young girl, they reasoned. It was said that certain powerful individuals within the family had taken matters into their own hands, silencing Uloma's parents to secure control over their wealth. As a young girl, Uloma could not comprehend the full scale of what had transpired. She only knew that the life she had known, a life of laughter, security, and warmth, was no longer hers to live. She felt the shock of the world shifting under her feet. The village that once hailed her family as the epitome of success and wealth now seemed to turn its back on her, as if her parents had never existed. Their lands were taken. Their home was sold. Everything that should have belonged to Uloma, the land that would have sustained her for a lifetime, was taken from her, sold off by her own uncles. Uloma's maternal aunt, who lived in a small, humble house on the outskirts of the village, became her only refuge. It was a place of safety, yes, but it was also a place of new hardships. Her aunt, though kind-hearted, had little in the way of resources. They barely had enough to eat, and the space they lived in was cramped. Uloma felt like an outsider in her aunt's home. The atmosphere was different, colder, and the love that had once filled her own home was replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Though Uloma tried to adjust, the absence of her parents loomed large. Her heart ached for their presence, and she struggled to find peace in the home that was now her reality. But it wasn't just the grief that burdened her. It was the bitter realization that her uncles had conspired against her. Uloma had no voice, no say in what happened to her inheritance. As a young girl, she was powerless. She was a female, and in her culture, that meant she had no right to the land or the wealth that was supposed to be hers by birthright. Her uncles, both from her mother and father's side, saw her as weak, an easy target. They connived together and sold off every single parcel of land. The house, the farms, the livestock, everything was gone, sold under Uloma's nose, and she could do nothing about it. The pain of the betrayal hit her in waves. Her heart would often feel like it was being torn apart. To make matters worse, Uloma had no way of fighting back. She had no inheritance to fall back on, no voice to speak for her, and no authority to challenge the decisions that were being made on her behalf. If she had been a boy, things would have been different. It was a truth she would come to understand all too well, that in her village, as in so many other places, a woman had no place in the inheritance of wealth. She was seen as a temporary part of the family, a person who would leave once she married, and as such, her inheritance was to be passed on to a male relative. In those early days of loss, Uloma was a shell of the girl she once was. She felt abandoned not only by her parents, but by the very family that should have supported her. The sense of betrayal festered in her heart. She felt the weight of their actions, the unfairness of her position as a woman, and the deepening sorrow of losing everything that should have been hers. Yet Uloma, though hurt, did not fall apart. Instead, she chose to endure. It was not an easy choice, but it was the only choice she had. Uloma accepted her new life with stoic determination. The pain was unbearable at times, but she clung to the belief that somehow, one day, things would get better. There was a fire inside her, a small flicker of hope that refused to die, no matter how many times it was smothered by the injustices of life. Her aunt tried to comfort her, but nothing could fill the emptiness Uloma felt. The land, the house, her parents, all of it had been taken, and she was left with nothing but memories, and the hard truth that life, as she once knew it, was gone forever. But Uloma was a fighter. She endured the hardship, swallowing her grief with a quiet strength. She took solace in the small things, the songs she would sing under her breath when the weight of the world seemed too much to bear, the moments of laughter with her aunt, and the hope that one day she would find a way to rebuild. She didn't know how, but she believed that if she kept moving forward, somehow, someway, things would change for the better. At night, when the world outside her small home was quiet, Uloma would lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her mind would race with thoughts of her parents, of what could have been, and of the betrayal that had stolen everything she had ever known. But through it all, her spirit remained unbroken. She would keep pushing, keep hoping, because she knew that life, however cruel it may be, could still offer moments of grace, and she was determined to find them. The years that followed Uloma's devastating loss marked a quiet shift in her spirit. Life, it seemed, had not finished with her yet. The relentless grief that had gripped her after the death of her parents and the betrayal by her uncles began to fade into a dull ache, still present, but less consuming. The loss of her family's wealth and the painful realization that nothing in her life could ever be the same again had crushed her youthful exuberance. But time, as it often does, brought change, not in the form of joy, but in small glimmers of hope, flickering faintly in the distance. At 20, Uloma had grown into a young woman who had known sorrow, but not yet experienced the full weight of what life could throw at her. She lived with her maternal aunt, who had given her shelter after her parents' death, and though the house was small and the living conditions difficult, it was the only home Uloma knew. In many ways, the house itself felt like a symbol of her life, modest, often overlooked, but still standing. But Uloma's world was about to shift once again. In a place like theirs, where the daily grind for survival often overshadowed any room for personal joy, the prospect of love seemed like an impossible dream. Yet it arrived in the form of a young man from a neighboring village, a boy who had been raised by humble parents and who, like Uloma, had learned that hardship was simply a part of life. His name was Obi, a boy whose gentle demeanor and quiet strength resonated with Uloma. He was not rich, not by any means, but to Uloma he was a beacon of light in a world that had long seemed shrouded in darkness. Obi was different from the men who had grown up around her. He didn't judge her by the poverty that had come to define her life after the loss of her inheritance. He didn't care that she was a girl who had lost everything. He didn't see the brokenness in her eyes. All he saw was a young woman with a beautiful heart, and that was enough. Their relationship began simply. They would talk by the village path after Obi finished his daily work in the fields. Uloma would find herself waiting for him each evening, her heart fluttering with the anticipation of their conversations. He would sit beside her on the old wooden bench outside her aunt's house, and they would talk about their dreams, their futures, their hopes, and the quiet hope that one day they could build something together, something better than the lives they had known. Uloma found comfort in Obi's words, in the promise of something more. She had long stopped believing that happiness was meant for someone like her. But with Obi, she dared to hope again. For the first time in years, she felt wanted, seen for more than the tragedy that had defined her life. In him, she found the courage to envision a future that wasn't built solely on surviving, but on living. It was no surprise when, months into their relationship, Uloma discovered she was pregnant. The news, while a shock, was also a source of joy for her. For so long, life had been filled with loss, and now there was a chance for renewal. She had always dreamed of becoming a mother, of giving her child a life free from the pain she had endured. Obi was overjoyed at the prospect of fatherhood, and despite the lack of wealth, he promised Uloma that they would make it work, together. But life, as it often does, had a way of turning things upside down. Uloma's decision to leave her aunt's home was not an easy one. She knew it would be hard, and her aunt, who had taken her in when she had nothing, was reluctant to let her go. But Uloma's longing for a better life, for something that felt like her own, had become too strong to ignore. Her aunt, though saddened, understood. With a heavy heart, she bid her niece farewell, wishing her the best. And with Obi by her side, Uloma left the small house where she had lived since her parents' death. The life that awaited her was far from perfect. Obi's family was kind, but their resources were scarce. They lived in a small hut on the edge of the village, where every meal was a struggle to prepare, and every day was another test of endurance. But despite the poverty, Uloma felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. The love she shared with Obi provided a kind of shelter that no material wealth could ever offer. Together they built a life based not on the riches of the land, but on the strength of their love. Their first child came into the world in the early months of the following year, a daughter whom they named Ifeoma, meaning good luck. She was their joy, a ray of light in a world that had too often been dim. But even as Uloma held her daughter in her arms, there was a part of her that still felt the weight of the past. She had been robbed of her parents, her inheritance, her birthright, and now, even though she had a family of her own, there was always the shadow of her past lingering in the corners of her heart. Still, Uloma pressed on. She and Obi worked tirelessly to build a future for their children, though every day was a struggle. As time passed, they were blessed with 3 more children, 2 daughters, Adais and Chiamaka, and their only son, Chukwudi, the one who was meant to carry on the family name. Uloma's heart swelled with love for her children, each one a symbol of hope, a symbol of the life she was determined to give them, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. But as the years passed, Uloma's life would once again be shattered by tragedy. Uloma's world, once again, was about to be torn apart by tragedy. The months following the birth of her children had been filled with love, labor, and a quiet sense of purpose. Uloma and Obi, though poor in material wealth, had found peace in the simple joys of family life. Their children, though young and full of mischief, brought them a kind of happiness that wealth could never buy. The weight of her past, the loss of her parents, her inheritance, and the betrayals she had suffered, had not completely disappeared, but the love she had for her children gave her hope, a reason to keep going. She had vowed to herself that they would not suffer the same fate she had, that no matter the struggle, she would make sure they had a better life. Each day she would rise before dawn, make breakfast for her children, and send them off with Obi to the fields or the village market. Life was difficult, but it was hers, and she fought for it, day after day. Her children, Ifeoma, Adaizi, Chiamaka, and Chukwudi, were the light in her life. They gave her a reason to wake up each morning and continue working, continue hoping. They had so much potential, so much life ahead of them, and Uloma's dreams were woven into their future. It was a bright morning, the sun shining down on the village, as Uloma kissed her children goodbye. "Be careful by the river and don't stay too long," she called after them as they headed out to fetch water from the village stream. It was something they did often, a task as familiar to them as any other. The village stream was only a short walk from their home, a small, peaceful place where the children would fill their jugs and laugh and play along the banks. Uloma trusted her children, as any mother would, to be careful and to return soon. She went about her work in the house, preparing lunch and tidying up. The sun moved slowly across the sky as time passed, and Uloma was in the kitchen when a commotion outside the house caught her attention. She heard footsteps running, fast and erratic, and then a sharp knock on the door. Her heart leapt into her throat, and the moment the door opened, she saw a young boy from the village standing there, breathless and pale. "Auntie! Auntie!" he cried, his voice trembling with fear. "Your children! They've fallen into the river." For a split second, Uloma didn't understand. The world seemed to blur around her as the words crashed into her consciousness. Her mind raced. No, it can't be. But the boy's face, his wide, frightened eyes, told her all she needed to know. Her children, her beloved children, were in danger. And then, just like that, the calm, ordinary day transformed into a nightmare. Uloma's leg shook as she tried to comprehend what the boy was saying. Before she could even process his words, she bolted from the house, her feet barely touching the ground as she ran toward the river. Her breath came in ragged bursts, and the world around her seemed to slow down, as if time itself was playing a cruel joke. No, not again. Not again, she thought, her heart pounding. As she neared the river, the sight before her was too much to bear. The villagers were gathered on the banks of the stream, some frantically trying to pull her children's lifeless bodies from the water, others standing frozen in disbelief. Uloma's breath caught in her throat as she reached the edge of the river, her eyes locking on the still, small forms of her children being dragged from the current. Their faces, pale and cold, seemed to stare blankly ahead, as if in shock, their innocence erased in an instant. For a moment, Uloma couldn't move. She stood there, her feet planted to the ground, her body frozen in place as a cold wave of grief washed over her. The world around her seemed to collapse, and all she could hear was the pounding of her heart in her ears. She couldn't believe it. Her children, the ones she had nurtured and loved with all her heart, were gone. Just like that. A young man, one of the villagers, gently took her by the arm and guided her to the edge of the stream. He looked at her, his eyes filled with sympathy, but Uloma barely registered his presence. Her gaze was fixed on the bodies of her children, who had been her life, her purpose. The pain was so overwhelming that it was as if her heart had stopped beating altogether. It felt like a physical wound, a gaping hole that nothing could fill. Her tears were slow at first, but they came like a dam breaking, uncontrollable and endless. She sobbed, her chest heaving with each breath, her body trembling from the weight of the loss. The villagers stood around her, too stunned to speak. The river, once a peaceful part of her children's daily routine, had claimed them, a cruel and unfair fate. Uloma dropped to her knees at the river's edge, her hands pressed to the ground as she wept. Her children, the ones who had filled her life with so much hope, had been stolen from her in the most senseless of ways. It was a grief so deep, so sharp, that it threatened to swallow her whole. But as her tears fell, something inside her shifted. This wasn't the first time she had lost everything. She had lost her parents, her family's wealth, and now her children. It felt as though life had turned its back on her, mocking her at every turn. As if to confirm her deepest fear, Uloma heard the familiar sound of Obi's footsteps rushing toward her. She didn't have to look to know who it was. Obi, too, had heard the news. She could see the terror on his face as he reached her side, and when he saw the children's bodies by the river, his expression crumpled in disbelief. His legs gave way beneath him, and he collapsed, unable to contain his own grief. It was too much for him to bear. Obi had worked so hard, had sacrificed so much to build a better life for his family, and now it felt as if the very ground beneath him had been pulled away. The shock, the agony, overwhelmed him. He clutched his chest, and in that moment it became clear to Uloma that he too had suffered a blow that he could not withstand. In a matter of minutes, Obi's body fell to the ground, and the villagers gathered around him, calling out to Uloma, urging her to stay strong. But she was not strong. She was broken, and there was no piece of her life left to hold together. Obi had suffered a heart attack, the weight of his grief and despair too much for his body to endure. And so, just like that, Uloma was left with nothing, no children, no husband, no future. She stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the bodies of her children and her husband, unable to grasp the full depth of what had just occurred. The river, which had always been a part of her children's routine, had now taken them, and as much as she wished she could deny it, Uloma knew deep down that her life would never be the same. The tragedy had come not once but twice, and Uloma was forced to confront a harsh truth. No matter how hard you try, no matter how much you fight for something, life could still tear it away in an instant. But even in the face of this unfathomable loss, Uloma did not allow despair to consume her. She had learned long ago that life would never give her what she wanted. But perhaps, just perhaps, it would still give her the strength to endure. As the days passed and the funeral preparations were made, Uloma, though devastated beyond words, took solace in one simple thought: God giveth and God taketh. It was the only truth she could cling to in the midst of her suffering. Uloma had not expected life to ever be kind again, but she had learned to embrace whatever fragments of joy it offered. Despite the unbearable losses, there was still one reason for her to live: to hope. Ogochukwu, her only surviving child. Her heart had once been shattered by the deaths of her 3 children and her husband, but in Ogochukwu there was a glimmer of hope, a sign that not all was lost. Uloma watched with pride as Ogochukwu grew into a beautiful young woman, strong and resilient, much like her mother. She had taken the scars of her past, just like her mother had, and woven them into the fabric of her strength. Ogochukwu had attended school, something that Uloma had never had the luxury of doing. She had worked tirelessly to make sure her daughter had the opportunities she never had, and now Ogochukwu had completed her education. She had found love with a young man from a neighboring village, a businessman who had lived and worked in Ghana. Uloma's heart swelled with pride when Ogochukwu came home to announce her engagement. It was a new chapter in their lives, one that seemed to promise a future filled with hope, love, and family. When Ogochukwu married and moved to Ghana with her husband, Uloma had been both proud and sad. Her daughter, the last of her children, had built a new life for herself. She had children of her own, Uloma's precious grandchildren. Although they lived far away in a different country, Uloma could hear their voices every day. Those phone calls, the laughter of her grandchildren echoing through the phone, were the highlight of her days. In those moments, she could almost feel their little hands tugging at her, see their bright, inquisitive eyes, and imagine holding them close. She never imagined that something so simple, so fleeting, could bring so much peace to her troubled heart. Uloma often dreamed of the day when she would meet her grandchildren in person. She had not seen them physically, but the thought of them filled her heart with joy. Every holiday season, when families reunited, she longed for the day when she could hold her grandchildren, laugh with them, and spoil them the way she had once dreamed of doing for her own children. Years passed, and life, though difficult, seemed to find a rhythm. Ogochukwu and her family would call, and they would share stories of their lives in Ghana. Uloma would listen intently, savoring each word, each laugh, each moment. She had grown older, her hair turning silver, but the love she had for her daughter and grandchildren never waned. It was the one thing she held on to, the one thing that kept her alive. And then, one day, the phone call came that changed everything. It was Ogochukwu. Her voice, usually filled with joy and excitement, was now filled with emotion. There was a tremor in her voice, something that Uloma had never heard before. Her heart skipped a beat as she listened closely. "Mother, we're coming home," Ogochukwu said. "We're coming to visit. The children want to see you. They've grown up so much, and I want you to meet them in person. We're coming back for Christmas." Uloma's heart leaped in her chest. Christmas, the time of year when families came together, when joy filled the air, when old memories were rekindled and new ones were made. The thought of seeing her daughter and grandchildren in person, of holding them in her arms, was more than she could have ever imagined. After all the years of waiting, it was finally going to happen. Uloma could hardly contain her excitement. She spent the next few days preparing for their arrival, cleaning the house, cooking the meals, and getting everything ready for the most anticipated reunion of her life. The day they arrived was a blur of emotions, joy, excitement, and a deep sense of gratitude. The house was filled with laughter, with the sound of voices Uloma had missed so dearly. Ogochukwu, her husband, and her grandchildren were there, and for the first time in many years, Uloma felt like her family was whole again. The warmth of their presence, the simple joy of being surrounded by those she loved, made everything feel right in the world. She watched as her grandchildren ran through the house, their little feet pattering on the floor, their high-pitched voices filled with excitement. Ogochukwu, her daughter, looked just as she had remembered her, bright, strong, and beautiful. Her son-in-law, too, was a kind man, and Uloma could see how much he loved her daughter. The house felt alive with their energy, and for the first time in so long, Uloma felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. That evening, as they all gathered for a meal, the air was thick with laughter and love. Uloma served the food she had prepared with care, smiling as she watched her family devour the meal. The children, especially, were full of energy, asking questions, telling stories, and tugging at Uloma's heart with their innocent curiosity. It was everything she had dreamed of, everything she had missed. But fate, it seemed, was not done with her yet. The evening wore on, and as Uloma moved into the kitchen to prepare another dish for the family, something happened that would change everything once more. The sound of an engine revving came from outside. Uloma didn't think much of it at first, but then the sound grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable, the screeching of tires. She froze, her blood running cold. The truck. It was coming too fast. Her heart raced as the noise grew louder. It wasn't just the sound of a vehicle. It was the sound of something out of control. Uloma turned to run to the door, but it was too late. The tipper truck, filled with sand and speeding down the road, had lost its brakes. In a split second, the truck veered off the road and crashed through the gate, slamming into the compound where Ogochukwu and the children had been playing just moments before. Uloma heard the deafening crash, followed by a terrible silence. Everything froze. She ran outside, her mind not fully grasping what had just happened. Her legs moved before she could even process the horror of the situation. She reached the scene in time to see the aftermath. The wreckage of the truck, the mangled bodies of her daughter, her son-in-law, and her grandchildren, scattered across the compound. Time seemed to stop, as if the world itself had paused to witness the tragedy that had just unfolded. Uloma's body went numb as she saw the lifeless forms of those she had loved so much. Her daughter, her grandchildren, all of them, gone in an instant. The house that had been filled with joy just moments ago was now filled with the sounds of frantic voices and desperate attempts to save what could no longer be saved. It was as if her entire world had come crashing down around her. The joy, the peace she had felt just hours earlier, had evaporated in a heartbeat. Her heart shattered once again as the weight of her loss crashed into her. Uloma knelt beside Ogochukwu's body, her hands trembling as she reached for her daughter. The words she had spoken just hours ago, "We're coming home. We're coming to see you," echoed in her mind, a cruel reminder of how fleeting happiness could be. Her last words through the tears were the same as before, "God giveth and God taketh." But this time they felt empty. The weight of tragedy had become a constant companion in Uloma's life. She had lived through unimaginable loss, the death of her parents, the betrayal of her uncles, the deaths of her children, the heart-wrenching loss of her husband, and now the loss of her daughter and grandchildren, each loss piled upon the last, crushing her spirit and draining her strength. Yet, despite the crushing grief, there was something inside Uloma that refused to break completely. It was as if, in the face of everything life had thrown at her, she had become something stronger, more resilient, even if the cost was too great to measure. After the devastating accident that had stolen her daughter, son-in-law, and grandchildren from her, Uloma was left in a state of shock. The world around her became a blur of emotions with no clear path forward. The once joyous house, filled with the sounds of laughter and life, was now eerily silent. The walls seemed to close in around her as the sorrow weighed on her chest. She could not bring herself to leave the house for days. She could not bear to look at the empty rooms where her grandchildren had played, or the kitchen where she had prepared the meal that they never got to eat. For weeks, Uloma barely ate, barely slept. She existed in a haze of grief, unable to see past the pain that had become her entire reality. The world around her continued to move, continued to turn. But for Uloma, everything had come to a standstill. The people of the village came to offer their condolences, but their words felt hollow, as if they too were mourning a loss they didn't fully understand. But as much as she wanted to sink into despair, as much as her body longed to give up, Uloma felt something stirring deep within her. A small, quiet voice whispered through the darkness of her grief, a voice that urged her to keep going, to keep moving, to keep living. She had lost so much, but she was not done yet. There was still something left for her to give. Uloma began to rise from the depths of her sorrow, though it was not an easy process. She would walk outside, slowly at first, her legs weak from the weight of her emotions. The village, which had once felt so vibrant and full of life, now seemed distant, disconnected. She walked through the streets, not really seeing anyone, but just needing the air, the space, the movement to remind her that she was still alive. As time passed, Uloma returned to the rhythm of daily life. She did not forget the pain, the loss. That would never go away. But she had learned, through all her suffering, that survival meant moving forward, no matter how difficult it was. She could not change the past. She could not undo the tragedies that had struck her. But she could live, and in living, she could find a reason to endure. In the days that followed the tragedy, she took up the small tasks that helped her keep her mind from spiraling into despair. She worked in her small garden, tending to the flowers and vegetables that grew there. The earth, in its simple way, became a source of comfort for her. The act of nurturing something, of watching it grow, was a small but powerful reminder that life, even in its most broken form, could still bloom, could still create something beautiful. But even as Uloma returned to the outside world, she was forever changed. The woman who had once dreamed of a life filled with joy and family was now a woman who had learned to live with loss, a woman who had been tested by the harshest of realities. She had learned, painfully and with great difficulty, that the world was unpredictable, that it could take everything from you without warning. But in that same world, she had also learned that resilience was a form of grace, a grace that could be nurtured and cultivated even in the face of overwhelming pain. Years passed, and though the pain of her losses never truly left her, Uloma found solace in the small victories. She helped the village women with their work, offering her knowledge and experience. She became known as a quiet strength in the community, a woman who had seen the worst that life could offer and still managed to stand, still managed to offer something to others. Her strength, though born of tragedy, became a beacon for those around her. Though she never had the family she had once dreamed of, Uloma found a new sense of family in the people around her. She had become a surrogate mother and grandmother to many in the village, offering advice, a listening ear, and the comfort of a woman who knew what it meant to lose everything and yet keep going. One day, as Uloma sat outside her small house, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she found herself reflecting on the life she had lived. It was a life filled with unimaginable grief, but also one filled with enduring strength. She had buried her parents, buried her children, buried her husband, and yet here she was. She had survived it all. What had it all meant? Her losses had carved deep scars into her soul, but they had also shaped her into someone who could weather the storm, someone who could withstand the worst that life could throw at her and still find the will to live. She was a woman who had learned to live with her wounds, to carry them without letting them crush her. Her life had never been easy, but it had been hers, and in the end, that was enough. Uloma's story was one of enduring pain, but also one of enduring strength. She had lost so much, but she had not lost herself. She had come to understand that the pain, the loss, was a part of who she was, but it did not define her. It was simply the backdrop against which her life had unfolded. And so Uloma carried on. She lived each day with the weight of her grief, but also with the knowledge that survival was a triumph in itself. She had endured the unthinkable, and in doing so she had found a new meaning in her life. She had learned that even in the darkest moments there was still something worth holding on to. There was still a reason to live, to keep going. Uloma had lost everything, but in the end she had gained something more valuable, the strength to endure.